John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory,
Welcome
glory,
to War of the Rebellion Stories of the Civil War. I'm your host, Leon, and this is a reading of the history, Reminiscences of the 19th Massachusetts Regiment by Captain John G.B. Adams. Chapter 8. Battles of Chancellorsville, Thoroughfare Gap, and Gettysburg. Wounded at Gettysburg and ordered home. At midnight, May 2nd, we were ordered to fall in and march to the banks of the Rappahannock, where a pontoon was again being thrown across. It looked like the 11th of December over again. The officers were called together and ordered to select 25 men from the regiment who would volunteer for whatever duty they might be called upon to perform. One officer was to go with them, and before the words had fully dropped from the lips of Colonel Devereux, Lieutenant Johnny Ferris said, "Please, let me be that officer, Colonel," and he was accepted. We found it hard to get 25 men because all wanted to go, and while the call was for volunteers, we had to select them. At daylight, it was found that the enemy had left the city. Our volunteers crossed and were on the other side to welcome us when we came over. We were the first in the city, but soon met General Sedgwick's division marching in from the left, having crossed below us. We found that Sedgwick was to storm the heights, and we were to support him. General Hooker, with the rest of the Army of the Potomac, had marched up the river and engaged the enemy at Chancellorsville, and we were to hold this city. In column by regiments, General Sedgwick advanced up the hill. We saw the white flag of Massachusetts as the 7th, 10th, and I think the 37th advanced. A rebel battery opened upon them, but the line did not waver. And on, even to the cannon's mouth they went. The battery was silenced, captured, and its support fled. We followed close in the rear, and when some 2 miles from the city were ordered back for provost duty. We expected a soft snap. Coats were brushed, brasses brightened, and in every respect we braced up. We turned in early for a good night's rest, but at 9 p.m. were turned out and double-quick to the left of the city, as our pickets at that point had been fired upon. At daylight, John E. Reb came marching home again, and filled the earthworks on the left in front of the city. Where they came from we could not tell, but they were there, and had a battery which was used to stir us up with good results. From provost soldiers we changed to sappers and miners. Dirt flew fast as we dug trenches for our own protection, and to obstruct the passage of artillery. We had several men slightly wounded, but none killed. On the morning of the 5th we fell back to our rifle pits in the city, recrossed the river, remaining on duty until the pontoons were taken up, and then marched back to our old camp. We had not slept an hour since May 2nd, and were completely tired out. I slept all night and awoke thinking it was time for breakfast, and found it was 3 p.m. We moved our camp to a delightful spot on the top of the hill, resumed our daily drills, and were once more under strict discipline. It was very hard to get leave of absence, but Lieutenant Sheckley made application, giving as a reason that he required an officer's uniform, having just been promoted, and it was granted. Mose was absent 10 days, and then returned, having purchased 2 pairs of stockings, a linen duster, and a brush broom. But he had enjoyed his vacation, and had 2 cents left of his 2 months' pay. June 16th, marching orders came. We waited until all had moved. Then, with 2 pieces of the 1st Rhode Island Artillery, took our place in the rear. 2 companies were ordered to march half a mile in the rear of the column, and Major Rice was placed in command of this detachment. We marched over ground which we had traveled before. The roads were very dusty, and the sun scorching. At times the woods on each side were on fire, and our men suffered badly. June 20th, we arrived at Thoroughfare Gap, where we remained 3 days, to repel and advance through the gap. On the 26th, we reached Edwards Ferry, crossed the Potomac, and at noon halted at Old Camp Benton, where we had camped in 1861. What changes had taken place since we were there before? Then, we were light-hearted, happy boys, expecting to be at home in a year at least. Now those who remained were bronzed and war-worn veteran marching back to meet the enemy on northern soil. Our old camp was a fine wheat field, and nearly all traces of our former occupancy were removed. We passed through Frederick City to Uniontown, Maryland, where we arrived the 30th, and were ordered on provost duty. We expected to remain here for some time, and on the morning of July 1st, Captain Palmer and myself were ordered to dress in our best and make the acquaintance of the families in town, so we could understand where the officers would be the most welcome. We had just started on this pleasant duty when the assembly sounded. We returned and found we must march at once. And we did march. 35 miles. Not halting until 9 o'clock at night, when we bivouacked on the field of Gettysburg, 2 miles from the battleground. All day we had heard heavy firing and knew that a battle was being fought. At daylight on the 2nd, we were ordered into line of battle on the left of Cemetery Hill, where we remained under a severe artillery fire until about 5 p.m. We had seen the advance of the 3rd Corps, and the warm reception they met. We saw them falling back and the enemy advancing. Lieutenant Sherman Robinson and I were lying side by side watching the battle. "Someone must go and help them, Jack," said Robinson. At that moment a staff officer rode up to Colonel Devereux, and then we heard the familiar command, "Attention, 19th! We are in for it," said Robinson, and with the 42nd New York we double-quicked to a point where the line had broken and the rebels were advancing on our flank. I was in command of the color company, and had just removed the covering from the colors when a regiment on our left broke. With other officers I rushed to rally them, and was returning to my place in line when I went down. I heard an officer say, "Jack is down," before I really knew that I was shot. I could not rise, and Sergeant Smith and Private Calliope came to me. "Put him on my back, Smith," said the latter, and under a terrible fire he carried me from the field. Our lines fell back as fast as we could go, and I expected that Calliope would be obliged to drop me, and I should fall into the hands of the rebels. But he kept on, and landed me in the field hospital of the 3rd Corps. Everything indicated that we were again defeated. But when our men arrived at the stone wall, by unanimous consent, they turned about, and with that wild hurrah that only Yankee soldiers can give, drove the rebels beyond our former lines. I found myself surrounded by men, wounded and dying. An assistant surgeon was in charge, and I asked him to look at my wound. He did, and said that I could not live 24 hours. I suggest that he stop the blood, as he might be mistaken. But he had no time to waste on me and went along. Upon examination, I found that I was wounded in 3 places, and all were bleeding badly. But I could not tell where the bullets had entered or come out. The battle was yet raging. Men were coming in thick and fast, the last arrivals being mostly rebels. Calliope had waited until the surgeon said that I should die, when he rushed back to the regiment with the information. In a short time, Lieutenant Mose Shackley appeared before me with one of his company named Younger. "Jack, old boy, they say you were going to die, and I thought you would like a canteen of coffee before you passed up your check," said Mose. "What are you lying on?" he asked. As it was quite dark. I replied, "Only the ground." And going to a rebel who was slightly wounded, but was comfortable, having a rubber blanket under and a woolen blanket over him, he said, "There is a darned sight better man than you are, with no blanket under or over him," and captured one for me. Making me as comfortable as possible, urging me to keep a stiff upper lip, he said he would like to remain with me, but there was a lot of fun at the front, and he must return. I remained in this place until late at night, when a surgeon came with an ambulance, and said I must be moved to the 2nd Corps Hospital, as this was too near the line of battle. Having no stretchers, they placed me on a board, and loaded me in. This movement started my wounds bleeding again, and I thought that the words of the assistant surgeon would prove true. But they drove me a mile, I should judge, and dumped me by the roadside with other wounded. I remained here until the next noon. The day was fine, only very warm. All was still except an occasional picket shot. The silence was broken by one heavy gun, and the shell went whistling over us, followed by another. Then opened the heaviest cannonading ever heard on earth. Shells burst over me, and on all sides. Solid shot plowed up the ground, and I expected my time had come. Many of the wounded could crawl away, but I could not, and must stand it. When the shelling opened, nearly all of the non-combatants were at the front, and they now made the best time possible to get out of danger. I lay near a gateway, where they passed. Down would come a pack mule loaded with cooking utensils, sufficient to start a stove and tinware store. Then a lot of colored servants, or a runaway horse. I would shout and kick, was sure that I should be either killed by shell or trampled to death. Would beg some skedaddler to get another and take me away. He would stop, look on me with pity and say he would, but before he could capture another, a shell would come along, and his place be vacant. At last I saw a staff officer whom I knew riding to the front, and called to him. He heard me, drew his sword, and drove a couple of men to me, who, finding a stretcher, had me carried to the rear of the barn, where an ambulance was found, and I was placed in it. My first sergeant, Damon, had been lying near, and I urged that he be taken with me, and my request was granted. Damon was wounded in the leg. The bone was shattered, and it was necessary that the leg should be amputated as soon as possible. We started for the rear. The driver was anxious for our safety, and it is possible he might have thought of himself. At any rate, he drove over a cornfield on the jump. Part of the time, I was in the top of the ambulance, part on the floor. Damon and I would come together hard enough to drive the breath out of each other, but we were only passengers having a free ride, so we could not complain. When at last we reached our destination, I expected we were both jelly, and would have to be taken out in a spoon. But we had held together, that is, I had. But Damon's leg was all broken up, and was soon amputated. They laid us on the ground on the side of the hill, near a stream called Cub Run. This was the field hospital of the 2nd Corps. Dr. Dyer, my regimental surgeon, in charge. He soon visited me and found that one bullet had entered my groin and had not come out. The other had passed through my right hip. I asked him what he thought of it, and he said, "It is a bad wound, John. A very bad wound." Officers of the regiment began to come in, and soon there were 7 of us lying side by side. They told the story of the battle. Lieutenants Robinson and Donoth had been killed. Also many of our bravest and best men. My company the day before had numbered 15, officers and men. Only Lieutenant Rice and 5 men remained. They also told me how well our boys had fought. That at last we had met the rebels in an open field and had won a substantial victory. They described to me Pickett's charge, how they had come across the field in 3 lines of battle, expecting to sweep everything before them. But when they arrived at our lines, they found our boys ready and waiting. That the result was more prisoners than we had men in our line. And our boys had captured 4 rebel flags besides. It was glorious news. It revived me, and my wounds pained me less than before. No matter how serious the battle, there is always a humorous side to it, which an old soldier never loses. So it was at Gettysburg. When the fire was the hottest on the center, the battery that the 19th was supporting lost nearly all its men. The captain came to our regiment for volunteers to man the guns. Captain Mahoney was the first to hear the call. Going to Company E, he said, "Volunteers are wanted to man the battery. Every man is to go of his own free will and accord. Come out here, John, Dougherty, McGiverin, and you, Corrigan, and work those guns." Lieutenant Shackley jumped to his feet and said, "Come on, boys, we must keep her a-hummin'," and they stood by the guns until the fight was over. Ben Falls, who was now a sergeant, had captured a rebel color. Coming in with it over his shoulder, an officer said, "You will have to turn that flag in, Sergeant. We must send it to the War Department at Washington." "Well," said Ben, "there are lots of them over behind the wall. Go and get one. I did." I told this story several years ago at a campfire. Since then I have heard it told by others, and it is located and dressed up in other ways. But it is my story, and true at that. We lay side by side until the morning of July 4th, when the ambulance came to take us to the station. One after another was loaded in. I said, "Save a good place for me," but was informed that the orders of the surgeon were not to take me. I sent for the surgeon, who came and said that I must not be moved for 2 weeks. I saw the ambulance drive away, then buried my face in the ground and cried like a baby. Other wounded were brought to fill the vacant places. Duncan Sherwood of Company A was one, so I had company. Mike Scannell had also remained, being wounded in the arm, and rendered valuable service to Sherwood and myself. Directly in front of us were 2 amputating tables, which were always busy. We saw several men whom we knew placed on them and removed, minus a leg or an arm. The groans of the wounded were constant, and the dead were being carried past us nearly all the time. On my left lay a young boy. He suffered much but did not complain. One night, when it was time to go to sleep, he whispered, "Good night, Lieutenant. I think that I shall go up before morning." I urged him to keep his courage, but he said it was no use. He should die. In the morning I looked and saw that the poor boy had answered the last roll call. He lay by my side until afternoon, before they could find time to take him away. I had forgotten to ask his name, and no one knew him. His grave, no doubt, bears the mark unknown, and the records of his regiment say, "Missing in action." I remained here 6 days, and my wounds received no attention, only such as my comrades gave. They kept my canteen filled with water, which I used freely to prevent inflammation. Do not think that I blame the surgeons. No nobler men ever lived than composed the medical staff of the Army of the Potomac. But there were 20,000 wounded men, Union and rebel, on the field of Gettysburg, and the cases requiring amputation must receive attention first. One day, I was made happy. Lieutenant Shackley and Adjutant Hill came to see me. They had ridden back 15 miles. Some of the boys had found a chicken, and they had made a broth and brought it to me in an old coffee pot. It was the first thing that had tasted good, and I shared it with Sherwood. Some think soldiers as hard-hearted. No hearts are more tender than can be found in the breasts of brave men. When those officers parted from me that day, not one of us could speak, and tears ran down our cheeks as we pressed each other's hands. My mind had been quite active, and I had come to the conclusion that I would move my lodging as soon as possible. One surgeon had said that I would not live 24 hours, and another that I must remain where I was 2 weeks. It struck me that to die in 24 hours or stay where I was 2 weeks would neither be pleasant for myself nor those near me. I talked the matter over with Sherwood. We counted our cash and found that we had $5 each, and we formed a syndicate. We made Mike Scannell our agent, with instructions to bring some kind of conveyance to take us off the field. The next morning he reported with a citizen, a horse and side-spring wagon. The whole lot was not worth $10, but we paid our money and were loaded and on our way to Littletown, where we arrived in due time and were driven to a church which had been converted into a temporary hospital. We found it nearly full, but they made room for us. I had a nice place on top of the pews in the broad aisle. There was no organization of the hospital. 2 of the town doctors were doing all they could, being assisted by the women. No doubt our Massachusetts women would do the same kind of work should the emergency arise. But I cannot speak in too high praise of the women of Littletown. They would dress the shattered arm of some poor boy, wash the blood from the wounds of another, thinking only of what they could do to relieve suffering. It was like getting home. My wounds were in a frightful condition. They had not been dressed, and the maggots were crawling into them. As soon as we were settled, the ladies came to see what they could do. They were anxious to dress our wounds, but it required more hospital accommodations than the church afforded. So they washed our hands and faces, and made us as comfortable as possible. A real motherly woman asked what I wanted to eat. I had eaten little except the chicken Billy and Mose brought me. And when she said she had chicken broth, I said, "Bring me 2 or 3. As soon as possible she came up with a large pan full of broth, but the trouble was I could not sit up to eat it. At my suggestion, she brought the prettiest girl in the room, who put her left arm around me and let me lean my head on her shoulder, while she fed me with the broth. Oh, it was nice. Either the broth or the young lady's presence revived me. My new friend's name was Lucy. She said, "Don't take breakfast until I come. because I will bring yours from home." Bright and early, Lucy was on hand with a pan of milk toast. She had seen me eat the night before and brought enough for 6. As she was called away for a few moments, I spoke to the boys who were near, and they soon reduced the surplus. We remained here 2 days. While I had the best care they could give, I was growing worse. I had a high fever, and my wounds were getting inflamed. At times I would lie in a stupor for hours. One day I rallied, and found the church deserted, except Lucy and myself. Soon, 2 men came in. "Are you going?" they asked. Lucy said, "No." Mother told me if any were not able to be moved to bring them home, and we would care for them. He is not able, and must not go. The temptation was strong to stay, but a moment's reflection told me that I required hospital treatment, and I explained the danger to her. The men then carried me to the train and placed me on the floor of a baggage car. Lucy came with us, fixed my head all right, and, as a good sister should, kissed me goodbye, and we were off for Baltimore. I was so weak that the real name of Lucy passed out of my mind, and I have never seen her since, but have ever prayed that the blessings of heaven be showered upon her. For her constant care, the last day in the old church saved me from fever. The ride to Baltimore was terrible. The air was bad. Groans of the wounded were constant, and could be heard above the rattle of the car. I did not believe it was possible for me to live to reach the station. But I survived, although many of our number did not. We arrived in Baltimore about 3 o'clock in the morning, were placed in ambulances, and driven over the rough pavements to the Newton University Hospital. The next day, for the first time, my wounds were dressed. The surgeon placed a large syringe where the ball had entered and forced water through the opening. Maggots, pieces of clothing and bone came out. Then they probed for the ball, which had entered the groin, found it had struck the bone and glanced downward, lodging in the leg, where it yet remains. We received the best possible care from the surgeons and attendants. Ladies visited the hospital every day, loaded with delicacies for our comfort. I did a foolish thing while in the hospital, which came near ending my earthly experience. One day an officer slightly wounded came in and said the paymaster was at the custom house, and if we could get there we could receive 2 months' pay. On the bed next mine lay Lieutenant Bob Stewart of the 72nd Pennsylvania, wounded in the leg. Neither of us had $1, and the thought of 2 months' pay in our pockets was pleasant. We talked it over that night. Bob was sure he could stand, but thought I had better not try. Still, I was anxious to go, so we bribed the nurse, and the next morning after the surgeon made his rounds we took a carriage and with the nurse started for the custom house. I fainted before we had gone a block, but kept on and was able to sign the roll which a clerk brought to the carriage and received the money. We returned to the hospital, and I suffered from fever all day, and when the surgeon made his rounds the next morning, he was alarmed at my condition. I dared not tell him what we had done, for the nurse would be discharged if I did. In front of me was a man who suffered from a shell wound in the back. In front of me was a man who suffered from a shell wound in the back. He was forced to lie on his face and was very restless. I told the surgeon that this man suffered so much that it made me nervous, and he ordered him changed to another ward. It was several days before I regained what I had lost by my foolishness. I had been here a little more than a week, when one day Mr. Robinson, the Massachusetts agent stationed there, came in and asked if I had a brother named Asa Adams. Informing him that I had, he asked if I would like to see him. My answer can be imagined, and in a short time he came in with my brother, who had left when the news reached him that I was wounded. He had been to Gettysburg, searched the field hospitals, found where I had been, but no one could inform him where I was, as I did not leave my address. He was returning home, stopped in Baltimore, and calling on the Massachusetts agent, found where I was located. As soon as I saw him, my mind was made up to go home. The surgeon said it was impossible, but I begged so hard that he consented, and in due time I was placed on my stretcher and carried to a hospital car. The cars were so arranged that the wounded were hung up by the stretchers, being placed on rubber springs. I was hung up in mine, but the motion of the car was such that I could not bear it, so was taken down and placed on the floor. More dead than alive, we arrived at Jersey City. We found that the mob had possession of New York, and we could not cross the ferry. After being carried from place to place, we were placed on a steamer and taken to Bedloe's Island, where we remained several days. Then to the Fall River boat. We found great excitement at the boat. Several Negroes were on board who had been driven from the city. Others jumped from the wharf and swam out to us after we were underway. They reported that the mob intended to fire the city that night. I received every attention on the boat, was placed in the ladies' cabin, and the lady passengers were constant in attendance, anxious to do something to relieve my sufferings. Handkerchiefs were wet with cologne and given me, and when the boat reached Fall River, I had a large stock, marked with nearly every letter in the alphabet. Every few moments some good woman would bend over me and say, "Shall I turn your pillow?" And wishing to please them, I would say, "If you please," although it had been turned 2 minutes before. We arrived at Fall River in the morning. I was placed on my stretcher, carried to the train, and taken to Brockton, where I was loaded into an express wagon and driven to the hotel. Here I was placed under the care of Dr. E. Dean, and in the afternoon was driven to Sharon, the home of my brother, where I remained 3 months, attended by Dr. Dean and nursed by my dear mother and sister. From Sharon, I was taken to Groveland, where I remained until December, reporting to the department at Washington and my regiment, by surgeon's certificate every 20 days. I enjoyed the convalescent period much. Colonel Devereux, Captain Boyd, and Adjutant Hill, with Mark Kimball and several others, had been ordered to Long Island on recruiting service, and I visited them often. I also sat on the platform, with my crutches, at war meetings, and was quite a hero. I found quite a change since 1860 men. I found quite a change since 1861. Then, men were very anxious to get to the front. Now, they were just as anxious to keep away. We had all learned that war was no picnic. Chapter 9. Regiment ordered home. Receptions. My first call upon Governor Andrew. Return to the front. All right, and now we're going to move on to our show notes. So I think this is a really unique experience about the Battle of Chancellorsville, Thoroughfare Gap, and also Gettysburg, and kind of what was happening beyond the battlefield after he gets wounded, right? So I'm really going to kind of just skip to Gettysburg, although the rest is interesting. I just, want to focus on this one bit here, because there's a lot to go over. So they weren't engaged until 5 p.m., and I want to set the stage for his wounding at Gettysburg and what exactly is happening for the 19th to be sent off. Now, I pulled this from historicaldigression.com, talks about the 19th Massachusetts Infantry at Gettysburg with various sources that they filed together. And on the morning of July 2nd, their brigade is moved into position on Cemetery Ridge near the copse of trees. And most of the day, they're just waiting in formation. And when Lee launches his attack on the Union flank, on both flanks, at 4 p.m., fighting in the Peach Orchard and the Emmitsburg Road, the men of the 2nd Corps just get to watch the whole fight. They're just watching as it's all happening. And the 19th Massachusetts especially had a clear view of the fighting. And when they saw 3rd Corps just like turning and running, because their right flank is only about a quarter of a mile away, they're like, oh man, like we're just watching them crumble. So apparently, General Meade held a consultation with Hancock's and Gibbon in earshot of the 19th Massachusetts as they stood just south of the copse of trees. And several 2nd Corps units had already been sent out in support. But with the 3rd Corps now completely collapsing, the Confederates are going to reach Cemetery Hill. And we kind of know how this goes. So the men of the 19th are sent out with the 42nd. And we know that part. And Colonel Devereux orders the 19th to double quick. But apparently he already knows that the order is futile. So the 3rd Corps is already broken, and there's dozens of these Union regiments streaming behind. And this is where, around this area, is when he gets wounded. Devereux picks out a small knoll between Cemetery Ridge and the Emmitsburg Road, and he decides this is the spot. And the senior of the two regimental commanders, Devereux, informs Colonel Mallon of the 42nd New York, like, this is where we're going to lie here until the retreating units are over. So I'm guessing at this point is when one of the units breaks. And our illustrious author gets wounded. So, because right after this, they fire 2 volleys and then they get up and run. And that kind of brings us to the point why his boys are running back to their original position and the rebels are hot on their heels. And he's being carried the whole way, why he thought they were going to get captured. So, and why they were getting flanked as well. And so they just had to book it all the way back to Cemetery Ridge. And then you have the charge of the 1st Minnesota right after that. So for the morning of July 3rd, the 19th Massachusetts just sits to the left and rear of the copse of trees. They were in the 2nd line behind the 20th Massachusetts. And when a gap opens with the Confederate assault on the Union line, they fill that gap. And Lieutenant Sherman Robinson is killed, and we know that. And he was unfortunately killed by a solid shot while he was eating his lunch, which, man, that just sucks. So they know that they see the pickets' charge is underway. They're on the line. We're just behind it. And as the Confederates get closer, a whole bunch of them are running for the stone wall in front of the 19th and 20th Massachusetts. As the Confederates hit the Union position, a gap is opened up in front of the 19th. And Colonel Devereux and the 42nd, and the 19th and the 42nd New York move into that gap. And General Hancock rides up, almost trampling some dudes, apparently. And he's like, should we fill this spot? And he goes, yeah, get your boys in there. And they enter into hand-to-hand combat. They break through the first line of Confederates, and they collide with the second. Remember, there's 3 lines of Confederates in Pickett's charge. So they hit the second, and this is when they start capturing those colors. And they had like 5 Medal of Honors, I think, that come out of this engagement. So the 19th Massachusetts captures 4 Confederate regimental flags. 5 of them are awarded the Medal of Honor, and that's Major Edward Rice for conspicuous bravery. And I want to read all 5 of those Medal of Honors, so I pulled them up. Here we go. And of course, their citations aren't very big. For Major Edmund Rice, although his highest rank is Brigadier General, his Medal of Honor citation is thus: conspicuous bravery on the third day of the battle on the countercharge against Pickett's division, where he fell severely wounded within the enemy's lines. Color Sergeant Benjamin Frank Falls is awarded a Medal of Honor for the capture of an enemy flag. Benjamin H. Jellison, his citation reads, the capture of flag of the 57th Virginia Infantry. He also assisted in taking prisoners. And for then Private John H. Robinson, who gets the capture of the flag of the 57th Virginia Infantry as well, receives a Medal of Honor. And Sergeant Joseph H. DeCastro captures, his citation reads, the capture of flag of 19th Virginia Regiment. So apparently a very incredible fight and melee as they're struggling here over the stone wall, it looks like, and maybe a little past it. And they're capturing all these colors from the enemy. So just amazing stuff. Now we're going to go back in time and go back to his wounding. He should be dead. His wounds are serious. He survived the cannonading from the rebels right before Pickett's charge. And it just seems that like so many points of time during the story, he should have died. And yet he's just spared, which is just crazy to me. But of course, bringing up the story that other people are retelling about Ben Falls having the rebel color and then telling people to go get their own is pretty funny. So I like that he likes to clear the air. Definitely reminds me of the flag of truce from the 155th story, where everyone has a story about it. I really liked that bit. Now, when he cries like a baby, because all of his boys leave him while he's wounded and he has to stay behind to essentially what he believes, probably at the time, that he's going to die on the field. And it's one of the, and he just cries. Some of the hardest cries I've ever had all had to do with my fellow Marines. Sometimes you just got to let it out, and I felt it in that moment when he wrote about it. So now, when the young boy dies next to him and tells him he knows he's going to die, and then the next morning he wakes up and he's dead, folks, the next time you have a drink, dedicate a sip to American soldiers who are missing in action, because all we have to remember this unknown American soldier is possibly just the passage in this book. And he deserves at least something, for he gave all for all of us here today. And I can't do much, but I can do this. Here's to you, brave young soldier. May you have found the peace you so assuredly deserve. And may your memory never be forgotten as long as vigilance is kept over the tomb of our unknown soldier. Now, feel free to also dedicate a sip or a drink to any veterans you know yourself who are gone or missing or have passed on or still struggle. It's tough out there. All right. Now, moving on. What I'm about to talk about made me laugh in such a painful way, but him deciding that he wasn't going to die on the ground and he's going to try and get better accommodations for himself. Turns out, man, even with VA healthcare, you still need to advocate for yourself. So not much has changed in all that time. And of course, I kid. The VA I go to is pretty good now. Sometimes. And I want to drive my head through a wall other times. But it's a heck of a lot better than paying someone $5 to get me to a field hospital. That's for sure. So, and then when he's in that church with a pretty girl, oh my goodness. That's how you know he's the main character in his own story, right? Oh, getting doted on by all those women later on. Oh, it's great. Anyway, we'll pick up the next chapter next week. Thank you for listening, and I will catch you in the next episode. My friends, Have a great one. And I'm sorry this episode is a little late. We're doing some renovations in the house, and I had to disassemble my desktop to get some things done. Only making the case for myself that I really need a laptop so I can do things on the move, but I guess that'll come later. All right, have a great one, and if you can check out my YouTube channel, you might catch me streaming. Feel free to stop by and take a look. I've been streaming Sea of Thieves recently when I am on, so you can stop by and take a look and chat if you want. Feel free. You can ask me questions about the podcast or anything that comes across your mind. I'm happy to talk about it. But I will also be sailing the high seas and robbing people. So have a great one and enjoy your week. Bye-bye.
Old John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. John Brown was a hero, undaunted, true, and brave. And Kansas knew his valor when he fought her rights to save. And now, though the grass grows green above his grave, his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. He captured Harper's Ferry with his 19 men so few, and frightened old Virginia till she trembled through and through. They hung him for a traitor, themselves a traitorous crew, but his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. John Brown was John the Baptist, of the Christ we are to see. Christ who of the bondman shall the liberator be. And soon throughout the sunny South the slaves shall all be free, for his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. The conflict that he heralded, he looked from heaven to view on the army of the Union with its flag red, white, and blue. And heaven shall sing with anthems o'er the deed they mean to do, for his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. Soldiers colors of freedom, then strike while strike ye may, the death blow of oppression in a better time and way. The dawn of old John Brown has brightened into day, and his soul is marching on.